In this lecture, we're going to look at DNS server name resolution. So these are the actual process that the DNS servers go through to resolve names on behalf of the clients. The first couple things the server is going to do is, first it's going to check its cache, and then it's going to look to see if it's authoritative for that DNS domain. When the server checks its cache, it's looking to see if it's resolved that name before, because any names that have been resolved would be placed into the server cache. If you need to clear the DNS server cache, you can use DNS command, which is the command we use for anything where we're managing DNS from the command line, and the switch is /clear cache. If it's not in the cache, the DNS server determines if it is authoritative for that particular DNS domain. And authoritative means that that server hosts the records for the domain. If my DNS server is resolving www.yahoo.com and it's not in the cache, it says, am I the DNS server for yahoo.com? If that's not the case, the next thing my server is going to look for is conditional forwarding. And this is just what it sounds like. The DNS server is going to forward that request if it matches a condition. And the condition would be a particular domain name. For example, I find out that 30% of my traffic is with Microsoft. Instead of resolving all those Microsoft requests, I could say if the query comes in from Microsoft.com, forward it to the particular IP address for the DNS server at Microsoft. So again, conditional forwarding, I'm forwarding based on a condition. Anything that we do in DNS is done in the DNS console. So I'm going to go up under Tools and come down and click on DNS. And I'm going to maximize the window. Let's take a look at conditional forwarders. So I'm going to go over, I want to right-click conditional forwarders and make a new conditional forwarder. So I would put in the condition, which would be a particular domain name, and then I would have to know the IP address of their DNS servers, which is fairly easy to look up on the internet. So I put that in. And then anytime a request comes in for that domain, it will be forwarded to the authoritative DNS servers. Of course, the only disadvantage is if their IP addresses for their DNS servers change, I need to come in and make a change in here. If conditional forwarding doesn't help me, we drop down to forwarding. I tend to think of it as regular forwarding or generic forwarding, but it's actually just called forwarding. And again, this is exactly what it sounds like. If it's not in my cache, I'm not authoritative, there's no conditional forwarding, and I'm trying to resolve www.yahoo.com, maybe just plain forwarding is set up, where I'm just going to send the request to another DNS server. Any request for which I'm not authoritative and there's no conditional forwarding gets sent to somebody else. And there's two reasons why we may choose to do this. Either we're looking to improve security, or this particular DNS server is a caching-only server. And caching-only servers are not authoritative for any domains. They literally only cache. So if we were concerned about security, we might do something like this. Maybe we have multiple DNS servers on our internal network, and we're concerned about that firewall that's on the border of our internal network in the DMZ, because if all four of those internal servers are going to resolve names out on the internet, I have to open up port 53 to the world. Well, if I place another DNS server in the DMZ, I can make a much smaller hole in that internal network firewall and say it's just port 53 to this one server in the DMZ, and then I'll allow that one server in the DMZ access to anywhere on the internet. The other great thing about this is that server in the DMZ is going to build up a heck of a cache, and let's say server 1 asks for yahoo.com, server 3 asks for that, well, it's already sitting in the cache, so it might overall speed things up. Let's take a look at setting up forwarding. I'm going to right click my server, go into properties, and then click my forwarders tab. So if I were forwarding to someone, and it looks like here it is set up to forward, I would just hit edit and put in the IP addresses of the servers to whom I would forward requests for which I'm not authoritative. That's how you set up forwarding. If none of that works out, we finally end up with root hints, where we're going to go up and talk to the root of the internet. The DNS server has a root hints tab that contains the names and IP addresses of all the root servers in the world. And there's a webpage, www.rootservers.org, where you can see a list and a map of all these servers. And that's built right into the DNS server. So the moment I install DNS, I have connectivity to all of the DNS servers out on the internet. Let's take a look at root hints. So I'm going to right click my server and go to properties. And if I go over to root hints, you can see the names and IP addresses of all the root servers on the internet listed. If you pay particular note, the one called A is 198.41.0.4. Let's go take a look at www.rootservers.org. Out here we can see a map that shows us all the root DNS servers in the world. If we scroll down and take a look, you can see the server named A is run by VeriSign, and there's that same IP address that we saw in our DNS server, 198.41.0.4. So what exactly is a root server? I'm going to hit cancel and we'll show you. I want to go up and I'm going to right click forward lookup zones and make a new zone. I don't care too much about any of these settings, but when I get to the zone name, I just type a period. And then I hit finish. Now you can see it names the zone root. If I go back into the properties of my domain controller, I can see that the forwarders tab is grayed out. There's no need for me to forward to anybody. I'm a root server on the internet. I'm the top of the food chain. People start with me, so I wouldn't forward to anyone. You'll also see that root hints becomes grayed out. I don't need to talk to my colleague root servers. I am a root server myself. So if either of these tabs are grayed out, the problem is you're a root server. Well, how do I unbecome a root server? I simply go in, click on that root zone, and delete it. It'll come back up and say, do you want to replace root hints? Put it back in. I say absolutely, and my root hints are back. Once I get up to the root server, we're going to begin following that fully qualified domain name www.yahoo.com to locate the record for that address. And we're going to start on the right and work our way left. The root servers have delegations for top level domains. Every time we want to jump down in the DNS tree, you need to have a delegation. And the delegation identifies the name and IP address of the authoritative DNS server for the next subdomain. Let's take a look at creating a delegation. Now, in order to be able to delegate to someone, I have to have a server that contains that subdomain, even if that server is myself. So let's make a subdomain of shadfarrell.builditright.com. So I'll make a new zone, and I'll call this tech.shadfarrell.builditright.com. And I create my zone. In order to forward queries down the DNS tree, I make a delegation. So I'm going to right click and do a new delegation. It says, okay, what's the name of the delegated zone? Well, in my case, it's tech. And then it asks, to whom have you delegated it? And I've delegated it to myself, dc.shadfarrell.builditright.com. I hit next and then finish. This sort of gray folder here is a delegation. So if somebody talks to the shadfarrell.builditright.com zone looking for tech, that delegation would say it's been delegated to another DNS server and contains the information on that server. Even though I'm hosting the zone and I've delegated it to myself, it's because it's in a different zone file. Normally, a delegation probably will jump them to some other DNS server. My root server would have a delegation for the .com domain, and the records would look something like this. If you're looking for .com, INS, meaning a DNS server, maybe let's say name DNS.com, and then it would have DNS.com's IP address. And that information gets sent back to my server. Once my server has that information, it uses it to contact the DNS.com server, the server that's authoritative for .com. And again, we move left, we're looking for Yahoo.com. Well, if you're looking for Yahoo.com, maybe you need to talk to a server named DNS.yahoo.com, and here's its IP address. That comes back to my DNS server. My DNS server is finally going to contact the DNS server that's authoritative for Yahoo.com. That DNS server has a record for www.yahoo.com in its zone that gives the IP address for that particular server. It goes back to my DNS server. My DNS server puts it in the cache, sends it to the client. The client puts it in its cache, and then finally it contacts the other host via its IP address. Now remember, hosts only communicate using the IP address, and the purpose of DNS really is to match that host name to the IP address. Once that's matched, it's not part of the actual communication. And this is sort of a classic. If you can ping a computer by an IP address but not by name, then your problem is DNS. Just to recap, DNS servers resolve names by first looking in the cache. Second, am I authoritative for that DNS domain? That is, do I have the zone that corresponds with the domain? Maybe there's conditional forwarding set up. If there's not, is there regular forwarding set up? And then if not, it's going to follow root hints. For internet resolution, use forwarding or root hints. And if internet name resolution is not working, you need to check for and delete a root zone. DNS servers have delegations that are used to locate authoritative servers lower in the database.